Beer is a civilized drink. Some anthropologists even suggest that civilization began with beer, that human beings first gathered in organized societies to farm the land, to grow grain, from which to make beer. The next time you sip a brew, consider how many centuries beer has been in the making. From the first farmers in the Fertile Crescent of the ancient world to the microbrewers of modern America, the production of beer has represented one of humankind's cherished achievements. Detailed records of ancient brewing have been found from Egypt to Mesopotamia. A series of stone tablets from Mesopotamia record what may be the world's earliest recipe, and it's for beer. The pictograms portray barley being baked into bread, crumbled into water, and made into a drink that made people feel blissful. From the earliest civilizations, the cultivation of barley spread north and west, and brewing went with it. Early brewers incorporated a variety of herbs and spices to flavor and help preserve their beer. Hops may have been first used for these purposes as early as the 8th century. After the Dark Ages, Christian abbeys were havens of agriculture and learning, and they refined the art of brewing. The monks made beer for their own dinner tables, for pilgrims and for other guests, and to earn revenue for the upkeep of their abbeys. There are still monasteries and convents commercially brewing in Austria, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Although herbs and spices continued to be used, the Belgians and Dutch introduced the use of hops in beer to Britain in the 1400s and 1500s, and later to the Americas. These were important steps in the shaping of beer as we would recognize it today. In 1516, the Bavarians made an early attempt to define beer in legislation with their purity law, the Reinheitsgebot. This rule stipulated that all beer was to be made only from malt, hops, and water. Yeast wasn't mentioned, because the brewers didn't realize they were using it. Their beer was fermented by airborne wild yeasts. Wild yeasts are still used in Belgium to produce the winey-tasting style of beer called lambic. Brewers did learn during the Middle Ages that the foam on top of fermenting beer could be saved as a starter for the next batch. This is a technique still used, in a more scientific fashion, to produce ales. Medieval brewers called the foam "God is good," but they didn't know that it was yeast. The mysteries of this microorganism began to unfold when, in 1680, the Dutch scientist van Leeuwenhoek developed an early microscope. Every village in Europe made its own style of beer until the beginning of a brewing literature in which the most successful techniques became more widely discussed and known. The first nationwide style of beer was porter, a dark brown, almost black brew made in London, England, from highly kilned grains. This beer is said to have been enjoyed by porters in produce markets, and it was dominant from the early 1700s to the early 1800s, a period during which steam power and transportation by canal made widespread distribution possible. From the early 1800s, porter, the London style, began to lose ground to paler brews made mainly in the Midlands town of Burton, which is still Britain's brewing capital. The original pale ale was actually quite full in colour, copper or bronze, but its brightness was attractive as drinkers switched from pewter tankards to mass-produced glasses. Pale ales intended to be sent to the British Empire in India were made stronger and with more of the preservative hop so that they could withstand the journey. The term India Pale Ale, or IPA, is still in use. In Central Europe, brewers had learned to produce more stable beers by a process of cold maturation, or lagering. They too began to make paler beers in the early 1800s. The dark brown lagers of Munich gave way to the amber Vienna style, remembered in some of today's Oktoberfest beers, and then to the golden type, first made in the town of Pilsen, Bohemia, in 1842. The original Pilsner beer is still noted for its fragrant, hoppy dryness. This style has been copied all over the world, but most of the imitators have become far blander over the centuries. Today, the overwhelming majority of the world's beers are in this distant derivation of the Pilsner style. The first European settlers in North America had made ales, but the great wave who came in the early to mid-1800s were from the lager brewing countries. In 1840, a brewer named John Wagner brought a cold fermenting yeast to Philadelphia and brewed what is thought to have been the first lager in the United States. Many of the new settlers went to Middle America, and from that central location they could deliver beers nationwide on the new railroads. Today's national brewers began to develop during that time. One of them, Anheuser-Busch, produced a light lager named after the great brewing town of Budweis, Bohemia. Over the next 100 years, the American Budweiser became the world's biggest selling beer, though most of its sales are in the US. The tide of national brews began to wash away variety in beer, but there was worse to come. Thousands of mom-and-pop breweries closed at Prohibition in 1920 and didn't reopen at repeal in 1933. In the meantime, their proprietors had found other ways of supporting themselves. 2 world wars, the Depression, and the growth of television advertising did the rest. There was not a hint of the tide turning until 1965. That was the year that Fritz Maytag, a student at that time, sold shares in the family's washing machine business to help save his favorite brewery, Anchor in San Francisco. Anchor didn't make a lager. It produced a curious hybrid style called steam beer, arguably the only indigenous American specialty beer at that time. Where the tide really turned was in Britain. The national brewers there had been abandoning traditional ales brought to maturity in the cellar of the pub and replacing them with blander, filtered and pasteurized products. In 1971, a group of beer lovers launched a consumerist movement called the Campaign for Real Ale, and now known to everyone in Britain by the acronym CAMRA. The success of CAMRA was witnessed by Jack McAuliffe, a young American serviceman stationed in Britain. In 1977, McAuliffe founded the first of a new generation of small breweries in America, the New Albion Brewing Company in Sonoma, California. This was the first of the new wave of microbreweries. At that time, there were fewer than 40 brewing companies in the US. By the mid-1990s, there were more than 400. These new breweries are tiny, but they've made the American brewing scene the most dynamic in the world.